Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of the Gatty lecture series. We're so excited to have you all here. I'm Tamar. I'm a PhD student in development studies, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the SEAT program. And we're really excited to have Professor Gandhi here today with us. We'd love to remind you to sign in when you enter. It's on the table where the refreshments are. And also you can enter to win a copy of Professor Gandhi's book in the raffle, which is very exciting. So I encourage you to sign in. And we have Sarah, who's a PhD candidate today, introducing our speaker. So I will give the floor to Sarah.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to the second Ronald and Janette Gatty lecture series of the fall 2022 semester. As was just said, my name is Sarah R. Miners, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Cornell. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi. Professor Gandhi is an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Her work operates at the intersection of colonial and indigenous studies, critical refugee studies, and trans-Pacific studies. Her most recent work, which she will be discussing today in part, is Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese refugee settlers and decolonization across Guam and Israel-Palestine, which was published open access by the University of California Press earlier this year. This summer, Professor Gandhi organized a public history exhibit in Guam titled Remembering Saigon, From Vietnam to Guam. Her ongoing projects include a podcast, Distorted Footprints, a Routledge Handbook of Refugee Narratives with Vinh Nguyen, a monograph tentatively titled Revisiting the Southern Question, South Korea, South Vietnam, and the US South. Her lecture today, Towards an Archipelagic Southeast Asian Studies, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and the Decolonial Politics of Nước, is co-sponsored by the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gandhi.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the warm introduction, and thank you so much for SEAT for inviting me here. I'm so excited to be here. So good afternoon, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, I'm coming here from Los Angeles on the West Coast, also known as Tavanga, so the traditional homelands of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. And just before getting started, I just want to pay my respects to the Cayuga Nation and acknowledge Cornell's history of Native genocide and dispossession, as well as honor the ongoing connections of the Cayuga people, past and present, to the lands and waters on which we gather here today. And I really want to emphasize this idea of lands and waters and the entanglement of the two, and it's something that I'm going to refer to and talk about further in my talk today, entitled Toward an Archipelagic Southeast Asian Studies, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and the Decolonial Politics of Nước. Okay, so as Sarah mentioned, this talk is based on my recent book, Archipelago of Resettlement, Vietnamese Refugee Settlers and Decolonization Across Guam and Israel-Palestine. And I'd also like to take the occasion to think further about the archipelago as method and what it might mean for a Southeast Asian studies praxis. And as mentioned, the book is published open access, so I'm really excited for you to check it out. And there is a raffle at the end for a hard copy, which I'll be reading from today. So make sure you sign in, everyone. And actually, before I get started, I'd like to just pass around some cards that has some information about the open access link, so you can check it out. And so, feel free to take a picture of the card, or if you want to keep one of the cards, that's cool too. So these cards are really special. They were actually made for me by the Guam Philharmonic Foundation, which I worked with for the public history exhibit that Sarah mentioned. I'll be talking about that exhibit a little bit more at the end of my talk as well. Okay, so I want to start by posing some kind of big picture questions for us to think about. What does it mean to think Southeast Asia archipelagically? What points of connection and convergence does an archipelagic method enable? So one way to answer these questions, of course, is to point to the importance of the archipelago as a geopolitical and spatial formation for Southeast Asian countries such as Indonesia and the Philippines, and to think about how the archipelago informs understandings of the nation and belonging. The archipelago, I think, is also a useful spatial analytic for thinking about diaspora beyond the nation, including refugee diaspora. That is, thinking about how each country, territory, or space of resettlement outside of the homeland constitutes what we can think about as a distinct island. But together, these islands make up a larger archipelago of diasporic collectivity. So in this talk, I'd like to put the figure of the archipelago in conversation with Vietnamese studies, as well as Vietnamese diasporic studies more specifically. So Vietnam, of course, is not an archipelago in the traditional sense, though the interplay of both land and water greatly informs Vietnamese geography, politics, and culture. And as those of you who work on Vietnam know, the Vietnamese concept of Nước means simultaneously water, country, and homeland. So I'm interested in that simultaneity, right? That non-contradiction between land and water. So in this talk, I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to suggest that an archipelagic method enables Southeast Asian studies to critically engage with other fields, geographies, and epistemologies. That an archipelagic method inherently invites connection and convergence, or what scholar Evyn Lê Espiritu calls, quote, critical juxtaposing, which she defines as the, quote, bringing together of seemingly different and disconnected events, communities, histories, and spaces in order to illuminate what would otherwise not be visible about the contours, contents, and afterlives of war and empire, end quote. So taking my first book as a case study, I'll show how putting the Vietnamese concept of Nước in conversation with Pacific Islander and Palestinian understandings of the archipelago enables a place-based theoretical framework for tracing post-war migration of Vietnamese refugees to Guam and Israel-Palestine. And this allows us in turn to grapple what I call in the book, the refugee settler condition, which I define as the fraught positionality of refugee subjects whose resettlement in a settler colonial state is predicated on the unjust dispossession of an indigenous population. So the second point I'd like to emphasize in this talk then is the decolonial potential of an archipelagic methodology. So in other words, I'll reflect on the decolonial politics of Nước as routed through archipelagic epistemologies. So in order to elaborate on the Vietnamese concept of Nước, I'd just like to begin by reading to you a bit from the introduction of my book before moving on to discuss the book's main case studies. Vietnam is Nước, water, country, homeland, land, and water without division, a contrast without contradiction. Nước Việt Nam, a home, a cradle, a point of departure. One island in an archipelago of diasporic collectivity. According to Vietnamese mythology, Vietnam was born out of the consummation of water and land. Alco, the mountain fairy, fell in love with Lac Long One, the sea dragon king. Together, they produced 100 human children, Bac Việt. But Alco longed for the mountains and Lac Long One longed for, followed by 2 decades of civil war and US military intervention. And then the division of a unified Vietnam from its post-1975 refugee diaspora, who fled war's aftermath by air and by sea, who touched down on new lands and were washed in salt water. Vietnamese refugees resettled around the world, forging new islands of belonging in their respective countries of asylum. Collectively, these islands make up an archipelago of resettlement, a post-war diaspora connected by the fluid memory of a beloved homeland lost to war. As the Pacific Ocean links what Tonkin writer Apeli Hauofa famously termed a sea of islands, so too does Nước connect the archipelago of Vietnamese refugee resettlement. But resettlement is vexed when refugees resettle in settler colonial states. Resettlement is unsettling when predicated on the systematic dispossession of indigenous peoples. This book asks, what are the political implications of refugees claiming refuge on stolen land? Do archipelagos of refugee resettlement reinforce ongoing structures of settler colonialism? Or can they be refracted through Nước, a land-water dialectic, to call forth decolonial solidarities? These questions challenge us to think through distinct yet overlapping modalities of refugee and indigenous displacement, shaped by entangled histories of war, imperialism, settler colonialism, and US military violence. They invite us to imagine new forms of ethical relationality. So this was the beginning of the graph. And then this kind of second poetic part. Nước, to love one's country, the highest virtue demanded of a Vietnamese. Nước, to lose one's country, to be without the life source of water. Nước, to make water/land, to quench the thirst of a parched heart. Okay. Oops. Okay, and this is a image of the Vietnamese mythology of the origin story. And so you can see here out the mountain fairy in that book one, the sea dragon king. And remember this image because I will be referring to it later in the talk. Okay, so how does Nước relate to the archipelago? So like Nước, an archipelago is made up of both land and water, a duality without division, a contrast without contradiction. Land, understood as, quote, a storied site of human interaction and a, quote, meaning-making process rather than a claimed object, to quote Mishiwana Gomen, is a key focus of Indigenous sovereignty movements. Indigenous sovereignty, moreover, is distinct from nation-state sovereignty in that the former, quote, embraces sovereignty and embraces diversity and focuses on inclusivity rather than exclusivity. And that's from Evyn Watson. So since land is settler colonialism's, quote, specific irreducible element, to reference Patrick Wolf, it is arguably at the heart of Indigenous people's struggles for sovereignty. Water, on the other hand, connotes fluidity, fugitivity, movement, and connectivity, the erosion of borders by the constant waves of the sea. Water is a salient medium and metaphor for diaspora and forced displacement from the Black Atlantic to the Trans-Pacific, from Syrian to Vietnamese boat refugees. Water, however, I want to say is not in opposition to land. The figure of the archipelago refracted through Vietnamese epistemologies of Nước remind us of the entanglements between land and water, Indigenous and refugee. That indeed, Indigenous peoples can be refugees of settler colonial displacement, and refugees can become settlers on Indigenous lands and waters. And I want to give a shout out to Evyn Gandhi, who's in the audience here. I really inspired by her work thinking about the entanglement of also of refugee and Indigenous narratives. Indigeneity's, quote, emphasis on the specificities of origin, place, and belonging, in other words, is not in opposition to, quote, movement, dispersal, and diaspora. And that's from Jody Bird, who's also in the audience. So this duality is most apparent in Pacific Islander scholarship, which theorizes Oceania as a life force connecting Indigenous island nations to one another, as well as their respective diasporas. According to Lanny Thompson, what he calls archipelagics emphasize, quote, discontinuous connections rather than physical proximity, fluid movements across porous margins rather than delimited borders, and complex spatial networks rather than the oblique horizons of landscapes. In sum, moving islands rather than fixed geographic formations, end quote. So archipelagics call to mind Edouard Glissant's poetics of relation, a philosophy grounded in the Antilles archipelago, in which each and every identity is extended through a relationship with the other. So that's a quote from Glissant. Relational archipelagics mark this book's metaphors and methodology. The practice of tracing an archipelago of Vietnamese refugee resettlement to illuminate an archipelago of US empire. So thinking about how the Vietnam War is linked to US military buildup in Guam and also an unwavering support of the state of Israel, but also a corresponding archipelago of trans-Indigenous resistance. And I'm borrowing that term trans-Indigenous from Chadwick Allen. So thinking, for example, about how tomorrow decolonization efforts and Palestinian liberation struggles are connected through the Vietnamese refugee figure. So the figure of the archipelago emerges from the specificity of these books' sites of analysis. Guam is actually part of a larger archipelago of Indigenous Chamorro land, the Marianas. Centuries of colonization, however, have divided Guam from its 14 sister islands to the north. After the Spanish-American War, the United States took over Guam, while Germany took over the Northern Mariana Islands. Following Germany's defeat in World War I, Japan ruled the Northern Marianas until its own defeat in World War II. So I just want to give you a little bit of historical context here. So to this day, the Chamorro people remain divided across these two distinct political entities, the unincorporated US territory of Guam, and then the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So to retain an archipelagic imaginary, therefore, is to resist what Chamorro scholar Tiara Naputi calls colonial cartographic violence, end quote. Palestine, meanwhile, has become increasingly archipelagic as Israeli settlement and occupation disrupt the contiguity of Palestinian life. In the archipelago of Eastern Palestine by French artist Julien Bouzak, he takes the 1995 Oslo Accords division of the West Bank in particular into A, B, and C zones as a point of departure, illustrating, in Jennifer Lynn Kelly's words, quote, how settler colonial state practice can create island formations without water, end quote. So now that I've elaborated a bit on the concept of Nước and how it relates to the archipelago, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the book's main case studies, Vietnamese refugee migration to Guam and Israel-Palestine, to elaborate on what I call the refugee settler condition. So just to give you a little bit more context here, from April to November 1975, the US military processed over 112,000 Vietnamese refugees on the unincorporated territory of Guam during what was called Operation New Life. And this was really the first US military kind of resettlement and processing of Vietnamese refugees after the war. And so we can kind of think about why is it that it happened on an unincorporated territory, right, rather than, for example, on the continental US. And then from 1977 to 1979, the state of Israel granted asylum and citizenship to 366 non-Jewish Vietnamese refugees. So for Guam, we can ask, how do Vietnamese refugees relate to the ongoing Chamorro decolonization movement? And for Israel-Palestine, the question becomes, how do Vietnamese refugees who were granted Israeli citizenship relate to the Palestinian liberation struggle? So I just want to talk a little bit about method. So Archipelago Resettlement is a profoundly interdisciplinary project that necessitated, for me, multiple methodologies, archival research, oral histories, and also literary and film analysis. So I conducted archival research in Guam, in Israel, and Palestine, and then the continental US to better understand how the US military in Guam and the Zionist government in Israel represented Vietnamese refugees and talked about their resettlement efforts. And I find that in Guam, the humanitarian rhetoric that newspapers and politicians used to describe Operation New Life actually retroactively justified settler militarism in Guam. And by extension, this positioned Vietnamese refugees in a structurally antagonistic relationship to Chamorro decolonization struggles that opposed military settlement, kind of irregardless of the individual Vietnamese refugees' feelings about this. Thinking about that kind of structural antagonism, right? So in Israel-Palestine, Zionist leaders such as Prime Minister Menachem Begin drew parallels between Vietnamese refugees and Jewish refugee history of displacement. But they did so while occluding the contemporaneous displacement of Palestinian refugees by Israeli settler colonial policies. Archival records, however, are largely told, as we know, from the perspective of those in power. And therefore, I wanted to turn to oral histories to better understand the lived experiences of the refugee settler condition. So in the oral histories I conducted for this project, I find that given the trauma of forced displacement, Vietnamese refugees express strong feelings of attachment to the lands and waters of their resettlement, as well as sincere gratitude toward the settler institutions that resettled them. And I talk about this further as a kind of refugee settler desire. So for the most part, they view Indigenous decolonization movements with wariness or sometimes even suspicion, expressing concern about further displacement under the uncertainties of what Indigenous sovereignty might look like. So given these entrenched structural antagonisms and affects of the refugee settler condition, I therefore turn in the latter parts of the book to cultural production from diasporic Vietnamese, Chamorro, and Palestinian writers and artists to probe what Raymond William terms emergent structures of feelings. So thinking about visions of decolonial solidarity that are not quite articulated yet fully in the social realm, but we see kind of visions of them bubbling up, right? In activism, in art and literature, and how to kind of build this into a larger praxis. So for the next part of the talk, I'd like to share with you some of these cultural productions that I found that can help us point towards decolonial refugee-Indigenous solidarities, right? How can we turn to literature and art to have a language to think about what seems actually so hard to think about in practice sometimes? And these are informed by an archipelagic praxis as well as understandings of Nước. So I'm going to start first with Guam. And the text I'd like to share with you today is a blog called The Decolonization Conversation, which was created in 2008 by Bianca Wang. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Bianca. So Bianca grew up in Chico, Guam, in a Vietnamese Chamorro household. Sponsored by Bianca's aunt, who had married a US soldier, Bianca's father and his family left Vietnam as refugees in April 1975. Landed at Andersen Air Force Base after a brief stopover in Manila, and then arrived at Arodi Point just a couple hours before the tents of Tent City were pitched. Bianca's Chamorro mother, meanwhile, was the first in her family to earn a college degree from the University of Guam, and currently works as a Chamorro language teacher. For Bianca, quote, having two different sides, one that is indigenous Chamorro and one that is fleeing from a country during a time of war, end quote, deeply influences her thoughts about decolonization, which to her is fundamentally about, quote, correcting a historical injustice, end quote. And I was very fortunate to have multiple conversations and interviews with Bianca. So in other words, Bianca inherits the historical legacies of not only US settler imperialism in Southeast Asia, but also settler militarism in Guam. And just a shout out to Juliet Nabalin for really theorizing that term, settler militarism, in the Hawaiian context, but I think it applies here in Guam or Guam as well. So after graduating from the University of Guam with a degree in business administration, Bianca worked as a ghostwriter for a political campaign before earning a Master of Science in Early Childhood Education. She currently works as an elementary school teacher for Guam Department of Education. So by invoking asymmetric histories linked via US military intervention, Bianca's blog invites readers to consider how archipelagic histories of US military violence present one analytic by which to theorize cross-racial solidarity between Chamorro decolonization activists and Vietnamese refugee settlers, to unsettle the refugee settler condition and address some of these structural antagonisms formed by settler militarism. So Bianca started the decolonization conversation blog in 2008, as I mentioned, while she was a student at the University of Guam, to reflect on debates regarding a proposed plebiscite endorsed by the United Nations for Chamorros to vote to change Guam's unincorporated territorial status to either independence, free association, or statehood. So a one-dimensional racial analysis might attribute Bianca's urgent interest in decolonization events solely to the Chamorro part of her identity. However, I want to emphasize the significance of her Vietnamese refugee inheritances as well. That is her inheritance of a decolonial politics of Nước. So in other words, what if Bianca is invested in questions of self-determination in the face of military buildup, not despite her Vietnamese refugee resettlement, but also because of it? So given her inherited history of US settler militarism in Guam, as well as US military intervention in Vietnam, Bianca is doubly positioned to critique the proposed military buildup of an additional 8,000 Marines to Guam that was announced by the US military in 2005. And then since then, there has been a lot of activism, of course, and pushback, and that number has since decreased. But this is a quote from her blog. She says, this kind of buildup, quote, calls into mind our colonial status. Did anyone ask the people of Guam first, would you like a couple of Marines in a couple of years? Was there a poll to see whether we wanted it or not? No one asked, but gave an order, and they are coming whether we like it or not. So this is really important too, right? In the context of the United States, which sees itself as a representative democracy, right? So this kind of understanding of no one asked us, we didn't have a say, as a native population on the unincorporated territory is really important. So identifying here as a part of the people of Guam, Bianca critiques the island's lack of self-determination, indexing Chamorro's complex entanglement with the US military. So it's important to note that a large percent of Chamorros do serve in the armed forces, and the economy has come to rely on US defense dollars. Bianca quickly mentions and qualifies in her blog that she is, quote, not anti-military or what have you, but she's, quote, just been kicking back and observing this for a while. So this here being Guam's colonial status that she mentions as an unincorporated territory, which doesn't afford its residents the same rights or privileges as those residing, for example, in the continental US. So as an example, people in Guam, while they're living in Guam, cannot vote for US president. So in another blog post, Bianca recounts an experience of trying to sign up for more information on an American online school's website, facing restricted access because she resides outside the 50 states, and then emailing the webmaster to kindly explain that, quote, Guam was a US territory. However, the webmaster responds, quote, we don't cater to international institutions. So Bianca ends this post. I hear some people laughing, so you see the irony here. So Bianca ends this post, the last from 2009, with this insight. Ah, international. So we're a part of this thing, but not really. So I guess Guam's kind of like the new kid in school. He's sort of part of the school transcript-wise, but socially he isn't. So what do we do about it? End quote. So I think Bianca's words here characterize not only Guam's seemingly paradoxical status as an unincorporated territory of the US, right? A part of this thing, but not really. But also Vietnamese refugee status as recent US citizens living in Guam. So sort of part of the group, but socially not. So by group, this could refer to the United States, right? So although US citizens, Vietnamese Americans in Guam face the same political restrictions as other Guamanians, such as the inability to vote for US president that I mentioned. Guam, however, can also, this idea of group can also refer more specifically, however, to Guam. So although Guamanian, Vietnamese Americans are not indigenous and not Chamorro, and thus not typically included in decolonization conversations on the island. So what role then can Vietnamese refugee settlers, shaped by a history of US war turned rescue operation, play in Native Chamorro decolonization efforts? So given their inadvertent role in humanizing and justifying the US military's occupation of Guam during Operation New Life, via those newspapers and politician rhetoric that I mentioned before, Vietnamese refugees embody, quote, the power to represent or enact settler militarism or Native Chamorro land. And I'm referencing Dean Cirillo here. So as settlers who stayed in Guam, Vietnamese refugees contribute to the ongoing dispossession of Native Chamorros. That's the kind of structural antagonism part. However, Vietnamese refugees' experiences of US military imperialism also present potential points of solidarity with Chamorro decolonization activists who are critical of US settler militarism. So US intervention into Vietnam was predicated on the colonization of Guam after all. And the decolonization of Guam could therefore inhibit future US military interventions into Asia and Oceania, preventing further displacement of refugees by war. So in other words, settler militarism in Guam harms not only Native Chamorros, but also refugees displaced by US military ventures. And as such, effective organizing around archipelagic histories of US empire could activate a coalitional critique of US military violence in its myriad forms. Moreover, on a small island with high rates of interracial marriage, subject positions and personal histories have become increasingly entangled, making it difficult to discuss distinct experiences of settler militarism. So what does distinct even mean in this context? So for individuals like Bianca, caught between divergent histories of indigeneity and refugeehood, subjectivity is hybrid and liminal, a reflection of Guam's own liminal unincorporated status. So in Bianca's words, what do we do about it? Vietnamese refugees, Chamorro natives, and those caught in the mix must engage in a decolonization conversation in order to become, to quote Dean Cirillo again, quote, multilingual in each other's histories, end quote. So that, I think, is the only way to resist some of these structural antagonisms that are enacted by settler militarism in Guam. So now I'm going to turn to the other side of my study, which is in Israel-Palestine. And the cultural text I'd like to share with you is this 2005 documentary film, The Journey of Van Wing, directed by Dookie Jor and starring the Vietnamese Israeli poet Van Wing and her father, Wai Wing. So after fleeing Vietnam by boat and spending months in a refugee camp in the Philippines, Wai was part of the third wave of Vietnamese refugees granted asylum by the state of Israel in 1979. And then born in 1982 in the coastal city of Al-Majal, Ashkelon, which was renamed Ashkelon by Israeli settlers, Van is one of Wai's 5 daughters. So after moving around, her family settled in Jaffa Dalit, a working class neighborhood of the southern part of Jaffa, heavily populated by both Mizrahi immigrants from abroad, as well as Palestinians displaced from the older parts of Jaffa near the sea. In 2008, Van published her first chapbook of poetry, The Truffle Eye. And in 2018, she published her second collection of poems entitled Vanity Intersection. So the journey of Van Wing is driven by 2 intersecting narratives, that of Van and her struggles with fitting into Israeli society as a second-generation Vietnamese subject, and that of Wai and his return to Vietnam to reclaim the ancestral lands he was forced to surrender to the communist state when he fled Vietnam as a refugee. And I have to say that the first time I watched this film, I was actually not that interested in writing about it. And I think it was because it actually had a pretty flattened view of Van's narrative. And I think that her poetry is actually much more interesting and complex than the representation that she's giving here in the documentary. And so this idea of actually the movie being about 2 intersecting narratives than just the journey of Van Wing was really important kind of insight for me. So I'm going to focus a little bit more actually about her father's narrative in my talk and thinking about how that can point to a different kind of knowledge production here. So in Israel-Palestine, Vietnamese Israelis occupy a vexed political positionality in between Jewish Israelis and displaced Palestinians, between the law of return for Jews, which the Zionist state upholds, and the right of return for Palestinians, which has yet to be recognized. But what happens when they travel from Israel-Palestine to Vietnam, necessitating an archipelagic analysis of their refugee settler condition? Are Vietnamese Israelis' journeys to return to Vietnam more akin to the law of return or the right of return in Israel-Palestine? So in other words, when Vietnamese refugees return to reclaim their ancestral lands in post-war Vietnam, are they asserting a birthright akin to Jewish Israelis? Or are they challenging the legality of the newfound state's land acquisition and redistribution, so the newfound communist state here, akin to displaced Palestinians, or both? So in order to answer this question, I'd like to turn to a scene towards the end of the film. And I'm going to show you a quick clip here, and then I'll explain it.
Ồ, bà ơi, con về đây.
Bà bên đấy con ra đây sẽ không rất vậy.
Vô nhà tao ngồi đi đâu người đất ha.
Nhà hắn phá nhà hết hả?
Phá rồi, mấy chục năm rồi.
Để bà rất là sống cái nó gì là sự yêu.
Sam thì như chục. Rồi đi xuống.
Bà cứ chơi xuống bay, vẫn sao?
Kìa, nhà ram ngươi thì mà đi vào đây xin.
Em muốn đi vào đây xin. Mexico. Mexico.
Con sẽ ta cái gì sắp ta xin hỏi.
Okay, so I hope you could hear it, but I'll kind of explain what's going on here. So in this scene, Wai, who you see here, guides Van and the documentary film crew through tropical trees and rice fields in search of his father's plot of land. As they walk, Wai asks onlooking villagers for directions, invoking the name of his father, Wing Kekmin, and they wave him forward down the road. After orienting himself, Wai raises his arms and calls out excitedly to the surrounding trees, "Oh, Bama Gombe," or "Oh, father, mother, I'm here." So Van follows, asking her father in Hebrew where his house would be. He responds in Vietnamese that the house is most likely gone by now. Van spots another house nearby and suggests, again in Hebrew, that they approach and inquire about Wai's familial home. Switching to Hebrew, Kwame replies that the neighbors probably wouldn't know since they are Olim Kadashim, or new immigrants. So surprised by the use of this term, which in the Israeli context refers specifically to Jewish immigrants who immigrate to Israel-Palestine under the law of return, Van parrots incredulously, Olim Kadashim me'efo, new immigrants from where? But before the viewer gets a response, the scene cuts to a different shot of Kwame pointing out the vast reach of his ancestral lands, while his daughter Van looks on admiringly. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this term and this politics of translation that's happening here. So Kwame uses the term Olim Kadashim, translates the scene of Vietnamese refugee land reclamation into the vexed vocabulary of Israel-Palestine's own land contestations. Olim Kadashim, derived from the word aliyah, refers specifically to Jewish immigrants who return to Israel-Palestine. In identifying the post-war communist sympathetic Vietnamese newcomers as Olim Kadashim, or new immigrants who have the backing of the communist state's authority, Kwame implicitly positions himself as a dispossessed native Palestinian in this metaphor's binary. And to be clear, I want to mention that such a metaphor does risk a historical erasure of the particular settler colonial dynamics structuring Israel-Palestine. However, by translating the vocabulary of land rights so charged in the Israel-Palestine context to a post-war Vietnamese context, Kwame also introduces a possible vector of distinct yet parallel experiences of land dispossession, along which solidarity between Vietnamese Israelis and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine can be further developed. So a turn to the English subtitles for this scene further facilitates this possibility. Although the term Olim Kadashim is politically neutral, perhaps even celebratory of Jewish return to Israel-Palestine, the film's English subtitles translate Olim Kadashim not as new immigrants, but as settlers, as you can see here, adding another complex layer of politicized rhetoric. So the word settlers in white text flashes across the screen twice, one for Kwame's assertion and then again for Van's surprise follow-up question, more explicitly framing Jewish immigration to Israel-Palestine as part of the Zionist state's structure of settler colonialism. So according to my colleague, Lubna Khatami, quote, the Palestine analytic moves beyond thinking of Palestine as an isolated issue or an ethnic or geographic-based cause, and instead allows for thinking through the particularities of Zionist settler colonialism as informed by and informing structures of oppression globally, end quote. So Kwame's usage of this term, Olim Kadashim, invites archipelagic connections between land dispossession and the settler colonial state of Israel and the post-war communist state of Vietnam, between Palestinians' indigenous politics of return and Vietnamese Israelis' refugee politics of return. So the journey of Van Nguyen, this documentary, reminds viewers of the importance of land politics for both displaced refugees and indigenous subjects. That is, the politics of return to the very soil, plants, and waters, to the Nước that sustained one's family for generations. So although the structural antagonisms dividing Vietnamese Israelis and Palestinians remain material, I don't want to erase that, I think the film does propose potential grounds for solidarity, or at least gives us a language for thinking about it, right? Between Vietnamese Israelis and distinct and displaced Palestinians, around distinct yet parallel experiences of land dispossession and subsequent struggles for land reclamation in Israel-Palestine and in Vietnam. Recognizing their own attachments to their ancestral lands, to Nước Việt Nam, Vietnamese Israelis can perhaps come to empathize with Palestinian refugees and exiles' own desires to return to their ancestral villages in Palestine and work to make those aspirations a reality. So in this last part of my talk, I want to move beyond the cultural productions I discuss in my book and think about archipelagic Southeast Asian studies and practice, or kind of beyond the academy, right? So which is to say, thinking about how an archipelagic framework enables us to do Southeast Asian studies in unexpected places, while still remaining grounded in material histories of diasporic and refugee movement. So to do so, I'd like to share some reflections on my experience working on a public history exhibit entitled Remembering Saigon from Vietnam to Guam, which opened at Tumon Sands Plaza in Hagåtña, Guam this past July, and which will remain up for a couple more weeks until September 15th. So here you can see a couple photographs from the exhibit, and I'm actually going to pass around the exhibit program booklet just so folks can take a look. Okay, so this exhibit asks, what does it mean to remember Saigon from the perspective of Guam? How have the fates of Vietnam and Guam become entangled during different time periods in history? This exhibit examines connections across cultures, colonization, and the Cold War. It opens with Vietnam's origin story, the tale of Ao Cờ, the mountain fairy, and Lac Ma Huan, the sea dragon king, which we talked about in the beginning of the talk, and we had that beautiful image. And then its resonances with Guam's own creation story, the tale of Hutan and Fuuna. We then detail how Vietnam's history of French colonialism and US intervention parallels Guam's history of Spanish colonialism and its current status as a US unincorporated territory. The majority of the exhibit examines Guam's participation during the Vietnam War and its important role in processing Vietnamese refugees after the fall of Saigon. So as I have mentioned, between April and November 1975, over 112,000 refugees were housed in Guam during Operation New Life. This exhibit highlights the stories of Chamorro Vietnam War veterans, Vietnamese refugees, and their Guamanian helpers. We feature historical artifacts, archival footage, important documents, and oral histories from the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam, local news agencies, the Memoirs Pacifica podcast, the National Archives and Records Administration, as well as collections from California. And the exhibit ends with reflections on how the stories of Vietnam and Guam continue to be intertwined in the present. So for this exhibit, I partnered with Guam Philharmonic Foundation, and we collaborated via Zoom for 8 months to accommodate a multi-sided, or one could even say an archipelagic-based team. So we had a set of collaborators in Guam. I was in California. Our project lead was in Washington, D.C. for a long time. And then we also had a collaborator in Virginia. So you can imagine just like scheduling, right? Time zones. So the painting of the Vietnamese origin story that I shared at the beginning of my talk was actually created by one of our team members, Omi Soto, specifically for this exhibit. And you can kind of see, maybe you can't see. Let's see. I'm going to minimize this. You can see in this third photo, okay. So we gathered together archival documents, as I mentioned, interviews with Vietnamese refugees and Chamorro soldiers, photographs from official as well as personal archives, and personal artifacts with two main goals. So the first was to highlight Guam as an important, though often overlooked, site of Vietnamese refugee processing and resettlement. And the second goal was to emphasize the entanglement of Vietnamese and Chamorro stories and struggles for freedom, self-determination, and refuge. And I was really warmed by the community's reactions to the exhibit. So people were really excited to see their friends and their stories displayed on the walls. So it's a really small island community, so folks know each other quite intimately. And in some cases, folks contacted us after the exhibit was up to donate and to give even more materials and personal artifacts to include in the exhibit. So it's kind of this growing, changing thing, which is really exciting. And we were not in an official museum space. And so in that way, I think we actually had a lot of flexibility to change what was on the walls and set things out and add more than we originally expected, which was really cool. So I see the Remembering Saigon exhibit as an example of an archipelagic Southeast Asian studies and praxis of doing Southeast Asian studies outside of the nation state context of Vietnam in ways that point to relationality and connections with other global South communities. And I'm motivated to pursue these projects, so both the Remembering Saigon exhibit, but also writing the book by a decolonial politics of Nước. So by a particular Vietnamese refugee inheritance that is cognizant of the violences of the nation state and by extension, the settler state. So my mom and grandmother were actually Vietnamese refugees who fled Saigon for a US military plane in April 1975. And they were processed in Guam for 10 days before resettling in Southern California, where I grew up on Luceño, Oaxaca, and Cunay lands. So this is a, I hope you can hear me. This is a painting of my grandmother in Vietnam that Omi Soto made for us. And then this is my mom here. So I was very happy that she's able to come with me to Guam. So I do this work to honor, their struggles and their legacies, and to pay my respects to the communities I come from, but also to the communities whose histories are entangled with Vietnamese refugee diaspora, as well as US militarism. So in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with 3 quotes that also serve as the opening epigraphs of my book, Archipelago of Resettlement. The first, by Vietnamese refugee author Lê Thị Minh Thuy, reads, "In Vietnam, the word for water and the word for a nation, a country, and a homeland are one and the same. Nước." The second, by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, reads, "Beirut was the birthplace for thousands of Palestinians who knew no other cradle. Beirut was an island upon which Arab immigrants dreaming of a new world landed." And then last but not least, by tomorrow poet Craig Santos Paris, "Remember, home is not simply a house, village, or island. Home is an archipelago of belonging." So I want to share these because I think that literature and art and cultural production is also a form of theorizing and theory. So I'm very informed by these texts that I've been engaging with. So thinking through the figure of the archipelago and the Vietnamese concept of Nước can help us think through the intersections of imperialism and colonialism, refugees and indigenous displacements, pointing us towards decolonial epistemologies for forging refugee-Indigenous solidarities in the present. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that very interesting talk. We have time now for some questions. So if people on Zoom want to start typing, and if people in the audience here want to start raising their hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. You were gesturing towards and throughout in the presentation this role of intergenerational politics, and especially at the beginning, as you were talking through Nước, I was drawn to your use of refraction, of course, and refractive memory, and how that plays throughout, right? So I was wondering if you could speak more to an intergenerational politics through your project.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because of course, Bianca, right, is a second generation, right? Hi, I'll come to the mic. Yes, that's a wonderful question. Sort of highlighting that intergenerational threat, right? So thinking about my positionality as kind of the second generation, right? Bianca as well as the second generation. And Van as well, right? This is kind of this daughter who was born in exile, born in the diaspora, right? But has this a particular relationship to the homeland. And I think that is really key here, and kind of like the politics, but also the decolonial promise that I'm trying to trace. Because I think for the first generation, there is just the very heavy experience, right? And trauma of displacement. And so sometimes it can't happen in that first generation to really grapple with, okay, what is the next kind of step of grappling then with kind of indigenous relationality. And so I think it is an intergenerational narrative where it is the second and third generation who is not turning their back or condemning that first generation, right? I think there's a lot of kind of homage and respect to that real struggle, right, of displacement by war. But I think that there is this opening to think about relationality in these new spaces of resettlement, right? And to think about that, yeah, kind of like decolonial politics of solidarity and coalition and what that would look like. So yeah, I appreciate you kind of pointing out that thread. Thank you. I should say too that I am not trained as a Southeast Asianist, so I'm really excited just to hear how other folks, what you're thinking about in your projects, whether this idea of the archipelagic resonates at all with some of the work that you're doing. I'd love to hear, in what ways the concept could travel.
First, thank you so much for this talk. Very fascinating. And really important work. One thing that I'm not quite sure what is I'm asking, but I'll ask you to speak a little bit to is I was really struck by the map that you put up of Palestine that was archipelagized. And well, I guess especially thinking about how water means so much in archipelagic spaces. The one thing that struck me as discordant between these things is whereas in island states, agricultural water can be as much home as the land is. In the Palestinian sort of analog, what would be water is very securitized and very violent. And I guess, yeah, I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I want to ask you to think about how these different dangers of forest water or forest violent land water get us to think about different things.
Yeah. That's a great point. I really appreciate that reading because it's not something that I thought about when thinking about this map. So this map was brought to my attention by one of my dissertation advisors. I was thinking, I'm interested in this archipelago. I think it might be a useful analytic for my project, but I'm not sure how it's working in the Palestine context. And so him, showing this map to me, it really helped me, I think, to make a little bit more concrete those connections. And then as I mentioned, of course, Jennifer Lynn Kelly, who's a really great scholar of Palestine, also, has written about this. But yes, I think you're totally right that there is a concern here, at least for this iteration, right, and this kind of representation of how an archipelagic politics might be kind of being understood in Palestine. As water here is like to represent, right, the kind of Zionist division of the Palestinian life. So life here and life worlds are associated only with land rather than water. So I just want to give you maybe a couple other examples, of how we can think about it. So I recently did another kind of book talk at University of Toronto, and one of my interlocutors was Professor Sarah Moon. She's an anthropologist at College of the Holy Cross. But in her kind of response, and so her work looks a lot at this sort of like, she does feminist Palestine studies, think about occupation in Jerusalem. And so her comments, I think, were really helpful because she prompted us to think about Palestinian diaspora also as an archipelago, and thinking about an archipelagic analysis as being really important for a lot of really feminist informed critiques of also a kind of state-based Palestinian vision of what sovereignty would look like. And so she was interested in how this idea of an archipelagic politics, right, can think about national liberation in ways that don't reify a kind of very solid nation state structure, right, or reproduce the kind of exclusions of a state, even if it's not a settler state. The other thing that I think I came across just in my broader engagement with Palestinian writing was the sort of longing and the key force of the Mediterranean Sea, so al-Bahar, and thinking about this longing for water and the sea, right? Particularly for folks, for example, in the West Bank, they're very cut off from the sea by the state of Israel and by these closed borders that limit their mobility. And so there is this kind of longing for the water and what the water represents as part of this vision of a reunited Palestine, right? Or for a lack of kind of these borders that restrict one's access to the sea and everything that means for their life world. So I really appreciate, that critique of how water might be functioning as something violent here. I just want to offer those other examples. Yeah.
The notion of home, right? You're from Los Angeles, there's a largest power community For the times they don't think of home as an island and sea or water. They think of the island present time. Oh, you're home. Right? And so if you look at the Thai diaspora, it's like twice. Right? It's not displacement. So how is that different from your initial? Because then the idea of creating a home in the US, to sort of imitate what is back at home.
So if I can just repeat that question and correct me if I get it wrong, but the question is essentially that the Thai experience is maybe more by choice than the diaspora here, and how does this change the relationship from what was been discussed?
Yeah, the repetition was just for the people on Zoom to hear. So thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And I think, more broadly, maybe beyond kind of the refugee context, what I'd, like to offer, kind of the work that I think the archipelago can do, is to think about connections of home and belonging that are outside of kind of like a nation state context. So kind of like you said, there is a, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, the forced displacement, to think about how does one retain a sense of community outside of a kind of a bounded structure, and think about how that can be fluid. But I think that this idea of the archipelago, I want to say, is also very place-based, right? Which is to say that it's also about being in relation not only with folks who might share a similar culture, right, or language, and how they're kind of distributed in other places, but also a sense of relationality in the lands and waters in which you then live on, right? And so that I think is where the kind of Indigenous question comes in for me, is having that kind of dual perspective of both the connection with people in other spaces, but also a very real kind of material connection in this new space that you call home. And maybe to think about, this concept of refugee settler desire that I mentioned before, so I think that in this desire, particularly in the refugee context, for resettlement and creating a new home after forced displacement by war, there is a desire, a really strong desire to put down roots, right, and to claim a new home. And sometimes that is articulated by creating a home, articulated vis-a-vis identification with the settler state. But I want to say that it doesn't have to be that way, but I understand why it's articulated that way. And so I don't want to, this goes back to the intergenerational question. My point here is not to shake my finger at the first generation, for example, Vietnamese refugees, but rather to really empathize with why that identification with the settler colonial state might happen, but also to offer an alternative and say that if you want a kind of a place space, there are other visions of what that could look like. That doesn't require one to feel like one is always living in displacement.
Okay. Is there a Zoom question?
There's not a Zoom question at the moment, so yeah, we can go. Yeah.
Thank you, Ellen. That was a wonderful talk. I'm just curious, could you pose a question? This is not, I'm not in Southeast Asian studies, but I'm thinking about the archipelagic kind of degenerative possibilities. And I'm wondering if you could maybe think about or think with us in terms of rethinking 1898 and a moment of specifically sort of what we kind of know as America, thinking of the US as a settler colony, thinking about settler colonialism, settler imperialism, colonialism, this moment of emergence of the US sort of as a saltwater colony, right? A settler colonial turn, and how to think about that archipelagically, right? In terms of thinking through the Philippines, right? Again, Hawaii, and then also thinking about the Caribbean and thinking through your engagement with Toussaint, right? But thinking about that moment of US emergence legibly as a
Right. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So for just a little context, 1898 is the end, right, of the Spanish-American War. And this is kind of seen as a key moment in like US sovereignty and jurisdiction. Like they're going to go beyond the so-called continental US, which also is like not a natural formation, right? But this idea of overseas empire, right? To take control or territorial control over the Philippines, over Cuba, Hawaii, etc. And yeah, so I think so one sort of comment that came up in my revision process was somebody asked, you know, this idea of the archipelagic, is it only like this a decolonial politics, right? And I think that you're right, and where I want to say that the archipelagic is also a framework to analyze empire, right? And in particular, my body of study is looking in particular kind of US empire and US militarism, but I'd be interested to hear if other folks, you know, think that the analytic is helpful. But what I'm trying to do here is not only to think about an archipelago of refugee resettlement, right, but actually to say that when we materially trace where Vietnamese refugees ended up post-war, that it helps us to illuminate this pre-existing or this much longer history of US empire. So, and part of this, I think, is a potential concern that area studies formations as an intellectual formation might only focus on US empire, for example, or in one part of the world, right? Which in a way doesn't allow us to, in a lot of our conversations, talk about Guam and Palestine within the same frame, which is to say it doesn't allow us to think about all these different histories, right, of US empire and US imperial formation. And so one way to do that, I think, as a method is to historically and materially trace, okay, where did Vietnamese refugees end up? It's actually not an accident that they ended up in these spaces that have these longer histories of US intervention. So thank you for the question.
That's great, thank you. There is now a Zoom question, so I'll quickly summarize this one from Billy. So yeah, so he found the archipelagic very thought-provoking, and he says he understands your emphasis on the refugee archipelagos in your research. It could certainly be applied to Chan diasporas across Southeast Asia, and I think Nick Weber points to this in his book in French on the subject. On that note, I found it striking that there was little emphasis on the dispossession of indigenous minorities in Southeast Asia during the 19th century by the Nguyen Empire. Why not emphasize that? It seems like it might inform some of the dynamics and comparisons with Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's a question that I actually get pretty often, and I just want to really applaud the folks who are doing that work to think about indigeneity in the Southeast Asian context. One of my colleagues, Kahin Center at UCLA, also makes the argument that Vietnam, in a way, is also a settler state, particularly kind of post 1975 in that communist state formation. So not that they don't, in Vietnam specifically, they don't quite use the language of indigeneity. It's more within the language of ethnic minorities, but there's still this idea that there is the kind of dominant ethnic majority that is kind of in control of the government, and in this desire for the post-colonial state to articulate a kind of state sovereignty in a way that's legible to the rest of the world. Unfortunately, that does mean a kind of dismissal of indigenous rights in this way. So yes, I really appreciate, I think that is kind of like the next step for this project for a lot of the folks who are thinking about indigeneity in the Southeast Asian context. So I'd love to hear about this project.
Great, thank you. We probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. So yeah, I'll have one here. Yeah, you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. If you could today, I'd like to ask on the next project.
Sure.
And because just by hearing the title of it, you're going a bit more into reason. And I wonder if you're bringing in the archipelagic method to continue your
So just to repeat the Zoom, this is about the next project, and if it will also incorporate these ideas on archipelago.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So I don't know if Archipelago, it's still very new, the new project. So just as a reminder, the new project working title is Revisiting the Southern Question. So that's a reference to Gramsci's essay, some aspects of the Southern Question. And then South Korea, South Vietnam, and the US South. So trying to triangulate those terms. So I'm not sure if archipelago yet is going to be like a key word for that project, but definitely I do think that there's a through line of an archipelagic method, right? Which is to say, thinking about a very kind of grounded and place-based project that critically juxtaposes multiple sites that are not often in conversation with one another in these ways. So just a little bit of preview of how I'm thinking about it. So I guess that maybe to share the two main kind of flashpoints for me that made me interested in this project. One is that when I was taking Vietnamese language classes at UC Berkeley, where I did my PhD, my Vietnamese language teacher, who was a kind of first gen, refugee and South Vietnamese refugee, he had mentioned to me that he and a lot of people his generation really liked Gone with the Wind. So I was really interested here in a kind of Southern nostalgia in the South, for the fallen South Vietnamese state is being translated into interesting ways into the lexicon of the US Civil War and the kind of Confederate nostalgia and what's happening there. So the other flashpoint for me was the January 6th Capitol riot, where, of course, there are a lot of Trump flags, but also a lot of Confederate flags, and also a lot of South Vietnamese flags. So Vietnamese Americans were one of those groups that voted very heavily, majority for Trump, for multiple reasons. Part of it is again, a kind of imperfect translation of anti-communist communist politics into a new binary of Republican versus Democrat. Part of it is, Vietnam has a very long and difficult history of Chinese imperialism. So they really appreciated this strong anti-China stance, which resonates, which means something different, right, in a Vietnamese context than it does in the US context. So, and this was something that a lot of the Vietnamese American community really tried to grapple with. Like, this is such a visible iteration of our community's nationalism being articulated vis-a-vis a kind of, Confederate nationalism and very strong anti-Blackness. So I want to grapple with that. I think a similar kind of holdover from the first project is thinking about these very kind of tricky politics within the Vietnamese refugee community and not to demonize them, but trying to understand why are these resonances are happening. So to connect with the South Korea case, I think thinking about the Cold War context, we also have this kind of imposed division of North Korea and South Korea, and thinking about South Korea as also the kind of space in which the US intervened. And I think in a lot of global South studies, there is perhaps a association of global South with revolution, third world liberation, socialist kind of politics. And so what do we do with these Southern spaces that don't fit in that frame? And so I'm interested in tracing these like Southern discourses and how they're moving across these spaces. So part of the project too is to look at Black soldiers who in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So thinking about that moment is also the moment in which the US military integrated prior to formal desegregation in the continental US. And so how a lot of Black soldiers are taking these legacies of what the South means, right? And then they're being mapped on in interesting ways into these new Cold War fronts in South Korea and South Vietnam. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's been great. I don't think we have any time for more questions, but I think that potentially feel free to continue the conversations. So thank you everyone for coming. I think this has been great. And thank you everyone on Zoom too.